So, I would like to introduce the discussant for this final plenary session, Reverend Dr. Nicholas Genevieve Tweed, who will start and the conversation about resistance and transformation today. What does it look like?
And so we now come to the twilight of this session. And so many of you, we've been exposed to a range of historical analysis that has taken us on a journey from part of our displaced beginning to our present point. So the panelists are now available, and you can ask questions and direct them to specific panelists. And the theme that will guide this plenary session is resistance and transformation today. What does it look like? And so by way of simply trying to frame it, Gerald Horne, in a recent book, identified the trilogy of capitalism, slavery, and white supremacy as the triple dimensions that have led to the facilitation of the dehumanization of African people and the continuation of that dehumanization. And I'm going to take the license to connect that to Martin Luther King's notion of the triple evils of racism, materialism, and capitalism, and militarism. And I'm going to try to challenge us to come to wrestle with this issue of transforming systems of power in order to break the cyclical nature of our resistance and struggle. And with that being said, I'm going to yield now to those persons who have questions, and you can please direct them to any or any number of the panelists. The floor is open at this time. Do we have some folk with some mics? Here.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. So today we have heard a lot about the racial struggle between different racial groups. However, we haven't heard much about the discrimination that goes on within our own community. As a firm believer that we can't expect respect from others outside our racial group if we can't even respect and accept those within our own community. So I suppose my question is, how can we as people of African descent work to fix the discrimination that goes on within our own community, whether that be with the disabled, the LGBTQ+, or even the Muslim community? That's directed at all of the panelists.
Again, good afternoon. I believe settings of this nature is important as we begin to bring together our differences. I do believe it's about conversation, ongoing conversation, consistent conversation, meaningful conversation. And I believe it begins with a basic understanding of respect amongst ourselves, not just in word, but in deed and in action. I think it will go a long way if we begin to demonstrate a degree of sincerity with our personal beliefs one to the other. Now, as difficult as that might be, I also believe it's going to require courage. And I think, as I said to Dr. Curtis Tweed a few moments ago, the challenge now is for us to be in a room on a consistent basis and not just discussing our differences, but perhaps more importantly, understanding our similarities.
Any other panelists? Sister Cole Tuckett.
Okay. Can you hear me? So something that we discuss often in youth parliament is about respecting yourself, starting young, respecting yourself, making sure that you are putting your best foot forward at all times, making sure that people see you for who you want to be seen as. And it also comes into play when we think about when you get older. If you want someone to respect you, you have to start from young, and you have to respect yourselves from young. So then when they get older and they see you, they say, oh, I know you and I respect you because of how you respected yourself and how you presented yourself when you were younger. So it doesn't just start when you're older, it also starts when you're young.
One word, intersectionality. Yeah. Intersectionality is understanding that you may be a part of different groups, but there is some commonality that if you all came together, you can fight in the same direction. I understand that as being part of women's groups, being part of Black groups, being part of the LGBTQI community, also being part of the workers of this country. The fight that draws us all together is that we understand in all of those groups what injustice looks like. And if we can start there and recognize that there is injustice in all of those groups, then we can start to move in the same direction. And so it's not only good enough to say that we have to understand that as a Black community, we have to understand that right within our own families. That's where we should start the conversation with our kids and our family members.
First of all, thank you. I think that's an excellent question. Sometimes the burden of the historian is not also just to look at individual action, but to look at the structures within which our individual actions take place, right? And just to point in a slightly different direction from my panelists, I'm not saying that the answers were not useful, but I just want us to think about the structural elements which are at play, which also influence the ways in which we treat each other as Black people. Sometimes Black division, well, I wouldn't say sometimes, in many times, Black division is incentivized by the structures in which we operate. You see what I mean? Oh, you can't hear me? Pass the next mic. Sometimes we're good now. Sometimes the structures in which we operate, economic structures, political structures, social structures, religious structures, et cetera, you pick one, right? Sometimes the structures within which we operate incentivize Black division. You see what I'm saying? Sometimes it's created, the system will create incentives for you to be harmful to another Black man, Black woman, person of a different gender, person of a different sexuality, different religion, et cetera, et cetera. There are rewards out there which help you create individualistic, we can say material rewards, so-called progress in some people's minds, but it's probably not collective progress, but still so-called progress in some people's minds. And that is incentivized by the structures in which we operate. You see what I mean? From the very slave ship. The slave ship is not just a vehicle of transportation, it's a vehicle of transformation. You're an African when you start on that boat in West Africa. Guess what? By the time you arrive in the West, you're just a Negro, so-called nigger. Excuse my French. You see what I mean? So there's transformation of your identity. You used to have community. You'd work together with whoever was in your ethnic group when you started. Guess what they train you through violence and the other acts of repression on that slave ship? They train you to who what? Depend on a white person for food. Stop and think there. Crazy, right? That's just the slave ship. We're not even going to talk about all the multiple centuries of structures within which Black people operate, which incentivize us to harm each other and be hurtful to one another. So while I do totally agree that we need to have some ethical reformation, we need to consider the structures in which we operate, man. And that's one of the reasons why, because sometimes these structures within which we operate, guess what? You could be as ethical as you want, but guess what? If someone says, hey, if we're down, if Dr. Tankard knows he's gonna get $1 million for betraying me, or if he's or he's going to get some type of social reward for betraying me, he now has a dangerous choice on his hands. And God forbid, something happened to his car, something happened to his material situation. Now he's looking at that, I might take that. I'm not trying to put Tank on the spot, but just throwing that out there as an example, right? That's an example. Master Tank, dude. He's going to take me to task afterwards, but we see how this operates, right? So I think we need to think about structure, and this is the reason why we need to address structure, because it's not just going to be on individual ethical choice alone, but it's also going to be in the reformation of these structures.
Thank you so much. The question, sister had a hand up in the back before the two that now have their hand up. Yes. And then I'm going to come to the two of you and then the sister over here. I'm sorry, then, Rajay. Forgive me, bro. I'll come to you next. Yes, do we have a mic? If the sound team can turn up the mics that are on the table down here, we wouldn't have to monopolize those cordless mics.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I have the opportunity of hearing the afternoon session, which I think is definitely very informative. We have these events, and in my opinion, more of them is necessary, and the formation that they take obviously should be directed at our youth. And I'm looking at middle school assemblies being a part of this, having the knowledge, not the education, I must say, but the knowledge. And race is going to forever be with us. Let us not be fooled by it, because race is not my black skin and my sister here white skin. It has been economical, and we know that. Sometimes in our black community, we become so entrenched in that white face and my black face and forget the real issue. Resistance, I came not thinking of resistance. My word is Dr. Tankard's. It's persistence, because
Sister, if you could pose a question, we would appreciate it.
The question, though, is, and I'm sorry if I took time there, but the question to all my panelists is, have we looked individually and as a group at oppressor becoming the oppressed, becoming the oppressor? In all of this, that we continue to have the conversation of race, what is your individual and as a group connection with the oppressed becoming the oppressor?
And
Thank you.
And before the panel respond, can I plead with the audience, given the number of people, and we want to try to get to as many questions as possible, if you could please frame a question succinctly, we would appreciate it very, very much. Panelists?
Can you hear me? One of the ways in which that tends to operationalize itself is that we have probably learned how to absolutely hate ourselves. Our historiography has taught us that. Our culture continues to teach us that. Our interactions continue to perpetuate that, and much of it, we are doing it to ourselves. And this is if so, in that sense, one of the greatest books I remember reading was Invisible Man. And that represented the capacity of which we do not see ourselves and do not empathize with our experience. And how many times have we tried to relate that experience to people of our own race, and what we get is indifference. That's another way we get made invisible.
And keep in mind that white supremacy is the practice of the transformation of a human being into a thing, a commodity, right? Empty space that can be filled up with your ideas about anything from sexuality, yeah? Because I think that was part of the motivation behind the question. But prior to the coming of the European enslaver rapists, we had different understandings about sexuality. Prior to the coming of the European enslaver rapists, our spiritual practices were different. So a lot of things came with that brand on our flesh. Right? And we have to take ownership of that. Part of education should be to retake the space of whiteness that is occupying African minds, right? That makes it very difficult for us to see ourselves with our own eyes. We see ourselves through blue eyes. And that's always dangerous if you're African people, because our vision of ourselves is so fundamentally corrupted. Who are we? How do we sound in the absence of our ancestors' ideas and our enslavers' ideas and assumptions about blackness? Who are we? Right? And where are we having these conversations? Well, the sad thing is that we're not. So our school systems, which are the gifts of, again, our ancestors, enslaver rapists, and I'll continue to refer to them as such so that we understand that they weren't just settlers. The hell is that? They weren't settlers. They were invaders. They were rapists. They were sociopaths. They were beasts made men. And it's okay to identify. This is not me being hyperbolic. This is the fact and the truth. You ask Turtle Island indigenous peoples of their experiences with the conquistadors, they weren't settlers. You ask the people of Haiti of their experience with the French, the language of love, I'm told. Anything but. So part of education has to be the reclamation of our story prior to the fracture that occurred when the European rapist and slaver stumbled upon our shores. We have to begin the conversation with the beginning, and we are at the beginning. Who were we before the slave ships? I was talking to a Turtle Island indigenous elder in Toronto, and she was telling me that before the white man came, they had 7 genders. That was whittled down by force of arms and propaganda to the 2 we have now, male and female. And they also have to deal in their own communities with the homophobia that comes when Europeans are the ones who are educating you that the binary that they've created is actually legitimate. It's not. That's an imposition. That's their mythology writ large. It ain't true. But can you begin to imagine yourselves as yourselves through your own eyes? That's the challenge. Your eyes are not blue.
Thank you. Brother Rajay.
Good afternoon, panelists. Considering that there's work that has been done and work that still needs to be done, and considering that, oh my goodness, I just had this laid out in my head. Sorry. And considering that, I'm gonna come back because I had it laid and it was perfect. I apologize, I'm gonna come back.
Yes, my sister. There's a mic right behind you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is Dr. Warren still here? Yes, hi. You said something about, which I found really amazing, which is basically rewriting histories to correct colonialist narratives is also a form of resistance. So for you and also the other panelists, what do you think is the most effective way to do that? Like, what are we looking at in terms of thousands of years of history and written history in particular in comparison to what is more oral history for us?
If she's going to respond to the question, then we'll come to you, my brother.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I can't answer it in totality. I can tell you what I do and what I do with my work. And my biggest thing is empowering other people to tell their own stories. And that's the type of work I do. I work with, in the UK, I work with school kids, and I tell them what you have to say is valid, your story is valid. So I'm not just talking about writing histories of our past. I think it's really important also to collect what we're doing now. That's part of it. I empower them to do that, and I empower them to find what their passion is. And if that's history, great. I mean, I had kids in what was supposedly the roughest part of, one of the roughest parts of London. I had 2 tall black boys come up to me after one of my talks and said they want to be archivists. When does that happen? Because what is archivism? How is that taught? How is it sold? It's sold as being for certain kinds of people. So what I tell young people is there's nothing that's for certain types of people. I also tell them the truth that they don't want you. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because one of the problems also in the UK is kids working really, really hard, getting to university, getting to courses that don't speak to them and speak to their needs, and also in environments where they feel like outcasts and are put aside. So there are lots of different things, but I spend a lot of time with young people. That's what I do. Because what I tell them, and I was actually in schools yesterday, I was at BHS in Cedar Bridge, interestingly, is that we need people to tell a lot of different stories. We need so many people, and we need them to tell the stories.
Yes, sir.
My question is in the context of the large numbers of African people who have been incarcerated in Bermuda since slavery. It continues unabated, and we seem unable to develop strategies that are going to minimize the number or eradicate the numbers that are ever increasing. And my concern is what happens in the future when these people are released into custody, into freedom. What's going to happen to everybody? So I think we need to have some strategies that, in the context of race and resistance, to alter the whole dynamic. Anyone can respond to it.
We have to be courageous enough to tell our children, our babies, the truth of where they are and how they got there. I think that's an important first step. Our children can go through primary, middle, and high school without really having sustained critical engagement with the land of their birth. That's incredibly problematic for me, because what that means is that I can, graduate from high school, go off to university, become an accountant, a CPA, which apparently is, you've done a big thing, or even a lawyer, done a great thing. But you don't know how your country came to be. So you can't begin to envision how you can bring a cure to the social ills that are right now menacing us every single day, blood in the street every single day. So we have social studies courses that don't critically interrogate why, the deeper why behind the creation of MOB and 4.2 and Parks Act. Where are the conversations happening in schools? Sustained over time so we could bring, because our children are brilliant. Our boys and girls are really brilliant, and they want to have these conversations. But we have to be about the business of nurturing the formation of dangerous questions in the classroom. Right? I don't just want to be talking about Sir Francis Drake and all of that, the Wars of the Roses, disconnected from the larger history that was going on. If we're going to have a conversation, we have to start from where we are. And how did we get here? How do we get to a place where Westgate is like 99% black? Why is that? And why does it resemble so closely the inside of a slave ship as far as the numbers and who is in the hull? Why is that? How is it that Jack Tucker is a damn national hero when he's a raging white supremacist? How we get there? These are dangerous questions. We have to dare to ask them, because that's some BS. Then we have a racist who was a hero in a country that was majority African.
Thank you. Let me, Sister Lynn, and then I'm going to go to the sister right here. She's been waiting.
Thanks for your question. I'd just like to talk about restorative justice. Cordell Riley, Hashim Estwick, and I have both been presenting overseas at restorative justice conferences. And I believe the government, including the ministries, are looking very closely at introducing restorative justice into our criminal justice system, and hopefully broadly across Bermudian society. It's something that's long overdue. It's something I came across about 5 years ago and realized it was something that it was a process that could be used in our community to help us have those very deep conversations. And in fact, we do use it in our Truth and Reconciliation community conversations that we hold in Bermuda. And those conversations have had some very powerful discussions, but people stay in the room because there's that degree of respect and understanding that has grown over a period of time. So I'm very hopeful that we are moving towards that process of restorative justice, not only just for the police service and the Ministry of National Security and possibly education, but also within the prisons themselves. So those conversations can happen about root cause, which is what you were talking about that we need to really address, because we're band-aiding a lot of our things today when we should be really looking at the root cause of a lot of the issues in our society.
Dr. Swan?
I'm only standing because the mic is hers. But you know, I want to address the past two questions about narratives. How do you rewrite these narratives, and also the question about the prison industrial complex. Vibes Cartel has a song called "Jamaica We Love." One of his lyrics is, "Cops and ghetto is a fatal attraction," and I think that's an experience that speaks to Black people and people of color across the world. It's something that's the prison industrial complex is part and parcel with colonialism. I think when we talk about the question of how to rewrite narratives, like what is a narrative, Christy and myself are both historians, but people have different archives. You know, like it's in the music we write, the music we sing. It's the artists that we sometimes write off and say they don't have political content because the lyrics may be inappropriate, quote unquote. I think there's an archive of the body. I look at intelligence documents of how Black people are surveilled. That's one archive, but there's many. It's in the soca, it's in the calypso, it's in the capoeira, it's in the samba, it's in the salsa. You know, all of these art forms have been captured by the state, and they get reworked as just modes of entertainment. But there are mad stories within that. It's in the film. You know, it's in producing new content. The essence of that is we have to learn different skills. We have to teach ourselves different skills in terms of how to recreate histories and how to reproduce those histories. They're not always going to be in books. They're going to be in all these different kind of formats. Speaking of the archive, you know, incarcerated Black men and women, that is another archive of the Black experience. There are still political prisoners from the Black Power movement still in the United States, still. So I think that's another important element in terms of when we talk about a Black experience and understanding Black people. I think that's a community that is often marginalized in how we understand ourselves because of the dynamic. And there is a real real physical dynamic of the they and us. But I mean, come on, wrong time, wrong place. You all know what I'm talking about. Wrong time, wrong place. We could switch roles. One of my classes on Black Power some years ago, we decided to write to political prisoners. And I had my students pick whatever political prisoner they wanted. And so one of the more popular responses came from considered Tupac's uncle, or stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, who's still incarcerated to this day. And he encouraged students, or one of the questions was asked was, what should we do? That's one of the students asked. And so he said, I think students should help form a national truth and reconciliation organization that could raise issues around mass incarceration and police brutality. My students didn't like the name. They decided we should form a group called Students Against Mass Incarceration, and they did some really phenomenal and amazing work. We started visiting a community in Jessup, Maryland. There was an African Studies group run by a former Black Panther, Eddie Marshall Conway, who was set up by the FBI. The founder of the Black Panther Party in Baltimore was an FBI agent. The founder. Well, I shouldn't say agent, but it was more than an agent. There are different degrees of agency. An agent provocateur. Like, he created the Black Panther Party to set up activists like Mutulu Shakur. He gets set up, he goes to prison, he was released some years ago. But in those sessions, it was phenomenal because, and I'm sure we've all, I wouldn't even say 6 degrees. We're 1 degree away from our own family members So, but in those spaces, there's still consciousness, there's still content, there's still ideas, there's still debate, there's still, mistakes that are made, and some mistakes were, refashioned and reworked. But in those spaces, I learned a lot. As it's striking that you mentioned the slave ship dynamic, because this prison was primarily African American in terms of like inmates, but the guards were recent African continental migrants to the United States. So they were Igbo, they were Yoruba. So I recall having a conversation about Igbo culture and Yoruba culture, and it's like, well, that's interesting, because when I think of Igbo, I think of this particular guard who's not the friendliest person. It's so easy to get into those discussions of like our interpersonal issues. I mean, white people don't respect each other as a collective. Like, is that the only question? And I think we can only really have these questions if we talk about power. If we're not talking about power dynamics, I think we're missing the point. I find it hard to believe that at some point in our humanity, we will all actually like each other as people. Like, I don't think that's gonna happen anytime soon. I think people will still disrespect one another at some point in the future. And we'll work through that. But I think part of the discussion that we have to have is power, but as been stated, we're afraid to have those discussions because those stakes are higher. Because then what do you do with it? We can, so I think I'll stop.
Will it be brief?
Yeah. I think also we have to have a realistic conversation about economics and the draw to crime as a way of economic means. And the reality is also when you look at, we send persons away from this country to get the highest level of education and still cannot return to this country and get meaningful jobs that match their educational background. And so it's easy for us to look at those incarcerated and say, well, they are where they are because they've committed crimes and that's where they should be. But we need to look deeper and at the question of how they made the choices that they made.
Thank you. Sister. I see you, but she's been waiting a long time.
Give up the mic.
Release the mic.
I would be interested in knowing from any of the panelists or anyone else in the room who might have an answer as to...
If I can direct your question to the panelists, please.
To the panel. What is current thinking about what a motivated and enlightened government might do through legislation or policy to begin to undo a 400-year-old legacy of oppression and disadvantage that we're now reaping the results of?
Okay. Anyone? One of the things is to look at structural change. So in the current configuration, one of the ways in which you can engage in some level of incremental structural change is the restructuring of a system of taxation, because that is the only structural mechanism that a government has to control the distribution of wealth. But part of the challenge in Bermuda is that you have the majority of oppressed people that are resistant to any kind of tax structural change because they have been conditioned to believe that it's not for them. That would be one thing. Brother Cordell.
Just two things. The gentleman mentioned about incarceration. A few years ago, I did a study on the profile of the inmates. And of the top 20 nations of nations who incarcerate their people the most, Bermuda was at number 13. And if you look at the table 20, there are a number of former colonies who are in that list of top 20. So the question begs, why is it that we who have been oppressed continue to oppress others? And that's raised up the game. With regards to the question by Chris, what can an enlightened government do? One of the issues, or one of the things, the solutions have already been there. And I think Reverend Tweed touched upon them already. In the Wooding Report of 1967 and the Pitt Report of 1977, a lot of the solutions were given. A tax on the transfer of wealth, income tax, and a number of other things to prevent two Bermudas from taking place. But they were resisted then, and we have clearly two Bermudas now. And so, yes, some of that is because of us. We have resisted that. But until we address those things, we would continue to be talking about it, and these young folk down the front here will be addressing them long after we've left the stage.
Yes.
This session is called Resistance and Transformation Today, What Does It Look Like? And earlier today, I got a brochure about studying your master's in science degree in African Studies at Oxford University, which is ironic because basically, land of our impressors are going to be teaching us about African studies. What my question is that why did we have to wait to the tertiary level to study and learn about African studies when really it should start with the kids and start in our schools, which is basically absent, because I believe in something in terms of teaching from the ground up. And if we're going to have to wait until this level to learn about our African studies, then we're going to be continually lost. Because I don't know if people know that African enslavement is just a blip in time, and that we had a whole culture before African enslavement. So while we are here talking about resistance and talking about race and all those sorts of things and how we've been enslaved and all of that, psychologically that maintains a mental enslavement in a way. So we need to break away from this and go back to the root, but not only at an adult level. We need to have our children be thoroughly engaged in this type of study. So what I would like to ask the panel is, we've got a lot of great minds in the room. What is it going to take to have this in a comprehensive way be taught to our children in the schools? Because basically that's where self-empowerment and Black self-empowerment starts, with the kids knowing their history this way.
Let me attempt to address that. First, let me say, it really first starts in the home, amongst us as a people. There are instances and sections of it within the curriculum, within the system, but the real earnings for me is on holding the teachers and the school system accountable individually. Because, because we come in these settings and it's all generic. And we say, what are we going to do about the system and our children? I want to take it a step further and say, where's your child in school? Who's teaching your child? And what is it that he or she is learning specifically? And then begin to build the momentum to have the conversation. I remember in school, during our days, I was able to develop a social consciousness just by reading the newspaper. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out and get the Royal Gazette and all the rest of it. But what I am saying, though, is that we have to bring a social consciousness to our children as early as possible. You can't wait until you reach that stage. You can't wait to have someone else teach him or her for you, okay? It starts with self.
All right. Hold up. Seeing as you have the mic, I'm gonna let you ask your question, then these two sisters, then Brother Commission. And then we're gonna come back over.
Okay, I have a question. So we come into these forums and we do this constantly. I've been to 100,000 of them. My question is, who on the panel has the class or the group or who's holding the meetings that teaches me how to get them out? Because we talk about white supremacy. That's our root. That's our problem. How do we get them out? How do we get out of the system that holds us bound with all of our education, with all of our insight, with all of our influence, with all of our major jobs that many black people have that put them in position of power, and we are still not empowered, with all of the black people who come to save the day when too many black people are gathering, and black people go in and sell us out or don't get us what we need. So who has the class? Because I would sign up, I would be there. Who has the conversation that says, this is the strategy that we are using to get us free
Question,
from...
please.
I'm asking the question, who has the class,
Okay,
right?
so
to get
is
us
that the
free
question?
from white supremacy, because that's the root. We're tired of protesting, we say. So I'm coming to the class, just whoever has it, please tell me.
Thank you. Panelists, now we have some of our young students who have taken the time to be here and are anxious to ask some questions. And so I'm going to ask if those of us that are a little more senior would be prepared to yield to some of our younger people that are here in order to give them a voice so that they too can be heard. Now, while they're gathering their questions, and if you can get a mic up to them, or if we'll begin with our two young sisters here who've been waiting, and I'm gonna ask if the panel, pardon me? Okay. We're gonna answer the question first, and then we'll go to our young people. So panelists, if you wanna answer the question.
I was actually going to answer the question before that.
Go ahead.
About
Speak into the mic.
okay.
Good.
I was going to answer the question about how do we create awareness within our youth, and I just agree with what my panelists have said, and it starts in the home, but it also just starts with general conversation and addressing the uncomfortable and sticky subjects that you wouldn't usually address or speak about on a day-to-day basis, and changing these uncomfortable topics into just general awareness, because it shouldn't be that a student graduating from high school does not know the name Sally Bassett. It shouldn't be that a student graduating from high school does not know about the Black Beret Cadre. And I just feel like if we don't have to rely on the education system. We can inform ourselves, we can inform our youth, we can inform our friends, we can inform our family. And it just starts with generic and general conversation about making sure that we have knowledge and that our community has knowledge.
Who's going to respond to the second question?
What was the second question again?
The second question is who has a class that will teach us how to engage in overcoming or transforming the system?
Got you. I know that my mentor, Melody Van Putten, is doing classes. And I was also, before it was chased out of Bermuda's middle school system, by folk who said they saw Satan when we were talking about African people, African woman with dreadlocks. said that at Clearwater Middle School. At Clearwater, we were talking, just presenting the Ashe, and this woman was like, "I see Satan," and stormed out. I was like, okay, that's fair. But the classes are here. What that was indicative of is that we are terrified, because we've been conditioned to be terrified of our own black selves. Yeah? Terrified. She stormed out, terrified of her own reflection in the papyrus of history. Can't see yourself, right? So the classes are here. Melody Van Putten would be that. My interest, because I got skin in the game, I got two sons, a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I thought it was very important for me as a writer, to start writing the story of Africans globally and in Bermuda in ways that they could digest before they're done wetting the bed. It's very important. So that the conversations that I'm now able to have are multi-level with my 10-year-old. Sometimes he's been known to be like, "Daddy, that's some white mess." I know exactly what he means, and we can talk about that because he understands things like police brutality. He understands, he knows the term white supremacy and what it means. It's a definition. There's a definition for that. I wrote the definition. So it's important that we use our skills to speak truth to our children so that they can start to imagine a different world. The end of this one, in fact. Not a better version of this one, but the end of this one. All right?
Okay.
Our children have to be architects of the destruction of the systemic injustice that lays all of us low.
Any other panelists? Then
I would quickly say that I totally understand the question. For me, the classroom is not just a classroom as a physical space.
Yeah.
I think that black people across the world are doing a lot of amazing things and have been doing so, but they're not on CNN. But they exist. Freedom is a process. It's not immediate. It's not like black folks became free and just really became free. Like this, it's a process. So there are degrees of freedom. And like Andre 3000 once said, he loves it when black people pseudo-celebrate, because half the time that's what we're talking about. Like parts of freedom, not the entire thing. So what I'm about to say is not the entire thing, it's just part of a broader context. So for some black people, the question that they're facing is, and people of color, rather, the question they're facing is not just white supremacy, but it's the sea level is rising. For example, there are movements of ecological justice, environmental justice across the Pacific. That's the vocabulary. A lot of places that Paolo went to and community worked with, they're organizing around how do we use indigenous technology to handle the rising sea levels that are coming. That is like an even playing field, because the sea is not asking what you look like, but it's growing. I'm in a context, as mentioned, where black people are being incarcerated at ridiculous rates. That's the vocabulary of the moment. There are places like the Songhai Center in Benin that are building sustainable communities that a lot of black people across the world are connected with and learning from. Depending on your mindset and how you're defining freedom, there are black people already doing this work. You're right. It's not going to be a class per se, but the ability to find people that are doing work, they do exist. Part of the challenge is finding those people, but I would say it's not in a classroom. But if you want to continue this conversation, please do contact me afterwards, because we exist. We exist.
Now, do you all have a mic up there? Can you send the mic up to those young people up there, please? Oh, I'm sorry. Come. And then I'll come to Dr. Maxwell first.
Hello? Okay. Hello. My friends and I are on the Human Rights Committee at our school. And so in our school, we would like to advertise our LGBTQI+ club so that students who may not be accepted by their families or friends have a safe, inclusive space to be themselves. However, we are prohibited from doing this, and I don't know why. Do you agree that we should be able to publicize this or keep it a secret and stay silent?
So before we respond to that
and I go to Warwick Academy.
Before we respond to that particular question, I'm going to let Dr. Maxwell respond to the previous question.
I'll respond to that.
You respond? Okay. Anyone want to respond to this? Yes.
One word.
Resist.
If you have learned nothing more today, know that your voice is powerful. Get your collective together and resist. Bring in people that can help you resist, because no one should be prevented from living their truth and have an expression of that truth. So if your school is preventing you from doing this, then let's get together and resist. I also want to answer the previous question from the class. I don't have a class, but I can certainly tell you that it was our hope in 2017 when we removed some of the upholders of an oppressive system, that the new government would start to move us in the direction to change that system and bring in legislation that will make it a better system for us to operate under. We have an expectation that they will do this through fair taxation, fair immigration, and a better education system. And we, as taxpayers, we as voters, we as citizens, should hold them accountable to break down these systems.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody can hear me? My name is Yassine. I am in my last year. I go to BHS, I do the IB program. I'm gonna try and keep this real brief because I know we had some issues with that. So as someone who is a student of hip hop and a student of literature and real hip hop and literature, I wanna ask, what position do you think the arts has in this narrative of race and resistance?
At this point, I'm going to probably try to answer two questions at once. And one of them is the fact that one of the things that we believe in is the fact that history itself is an interdisciplinary product. That means it brings in every single discipline, including that. Hip-hop must be in this must be part of the information that's provided as well as the vehicle upon which it provides it. And so that's one thing. That's one way we are moving towards, and that as you'll go into university, you'll find that that's what's being done now, is we're now moving in the institution toward a much more interdisciplinary approach. The second question is, about a couple of years ago, I had a student who was in my class, and we were teaching Sanjata. And he listened very carefully, and afterwards he came back and he said to himself that he learned several things from that. One, that his people had an empire that stretched for miles. Can you hear me? Two, that he learned how to resist. History became the teacher of resistance. And in this context, every class where you go into, where you're going to be told something that's historical, and you're going to be told about your people in that context, you're going to see them engaged in some form, even when the people that are resisting are different. But the fact of the matter is, he learned one thing, in that not only, and by the way, he learned something else too, not just resistance, but how to construct an empire afterwards. Sanjata constructed the most lasting empire for 3 centuries. And by the way, he couldn't walk.
Sorry. Something that I just wanted to point out is that Yassine, who just asked that question, is a youth parliamentarian, and he attends youth parliament. And I just wanted to use that as an example of these are the questions that we're asking, and we're trying to have our voices heard. And I just want to show you that this is our future. These youth, we are all of our future politicians, all of our future business owners, and I just want to show you that this is what we can do and what we can say, so don't shut us out. Our voices should be heard.
sir. So your question was, how can artistic, Yassine? Thank you for that. How can artistic expression, hey, Lord, I don't have my glasses on, I'm pathetic right now, play a role in this conversation that we're having today? I think it's very important to remember that the arts supersede any socialized reality, any socialized reality. And the arts express feelings and the truth, with the capital T, completely. The arts hit the viscera, they hit the heart, and they hit the mind all at the same time. And what we have in Bermuda, we really struggle to have an authentic arts culture, arts practice culture, because our culture, is dominated by capitalistic practice. When you express creatively through art, it supersedes that in a way that transcends language, in a way that transcends anything you can do in that moment. And that power of communication and that power of truth that is inherent within artistic practice could not be more important to this kind of conversation, and could not be more important to young people like you and me who still have work to do.
Just any of the other young people back there have a question? Yes.
Hello, my name is Giselle, and I'm also a youth parliamentarian, and I have a question. We've heard a lot today about a clear problem, and we've heard a lot about the system again and again, but I would like to know what all of us here, who have been here all day, can take away of how we can personally fix the problem from any panel member.
You would have to answer your own question. Panelists? I mean, we can't tell you what to eat. So you have a panoply of meals that have been placed before you. And it's a lot of information, to ingest. And so it is the hope that the seeds that have been planted, or the awakening that has been created, will be something that will now ignite in you a thirst to then pursue the quest for more knowledge, but not for knowledge's sake, but pursue understanding so it can be translated into a transformed life. Because abstract knowledge has never led a revolution. None of the slave revolts that we've been talking about, and none of the people that we have been talking about, are people that engaged in what they engaged in because they went to a school. They engaged in it because there is something deeper than the socio-political structure in which they operated that enabled them to hold on to a sense of their humanity that transcended the dehumanizing context that they existed in. And that gave birth to a hope that creates a tension in us that then compels us to engage and share in the engagement with others in creating a new world, a new reality. And your entry point may be different according to your gifts and your level of commitment. But each of us have to find our own way to connect, engage, and contribute. And so I'm not being dismissive, my sister. I appreciate the question that you raised. But I think that the burden and the responsibility is upon those who have heard to decide what they can take and ingest in order to become self-determining and agential transformers of our environment. Yes.
Also, just to pick up on that, we've got to understand that these are all struggles, and even as just thinking of my talk, I would speak just directly to your thing and recognize that freedom does not come overnight. It's all part of a long process, part of a longer struggle or a protracted struggle. So I would say, think of an issue that bothers you. You know, if we're going to reflect on 1959, the progressive group, it was an issue, one specific issue that bothered them. Pick that out, whatever it might be for you, and then network with someone else There's other folks here. Ask one of us once we'll finish this broader discussion. If you want to ask one of us, ask a parent, ask a friend, ask someone you trust within this community to see how can we address that particular issue. And from there, build community. Build community, whether it is organizations which are already in existence or you might have to form one. That's fine. But guess what? Continue to build until you can kind of work on that issue so that you can change society. Because what we need to understand, even when we talking about desegregation, it was multiple areas of desegregation. Theaters, hotels, economics, employment, right? All of these areas, it wasn't just desegregation one writ large, it was multiple parts of it. So you might be able to get in on some part of the racial struggle, struggle for gender equality, struggle for some type of political freedom. And depending on what your talents and skills are, you might be able to bring something to the table. Even to dovetail to the earlier question regarding the arts. The arts are critical. Music, poetry, performance have been a way in which our stories have been conveyed, especially in the pre-literary era, especially at a time when black folks were outlawed and were not allowed to write. How did we carry our stories of resistance? Right back to the slave ship. How did messages get transmitted? Huh? Beating on the walls of a slave ship to communicate an idea to somebody who's locked up on the other side. Rhythm, the rebellious potential of music. Sometimes we get caught up, oh my goodness, this is not conscious, this isn't. I was having a conversation with a colleague, and we was realizing that in the particular era that we grew up, we learned about Nelson Mandela through reggae music songs. Go figure. Learned about Marcus Garvey through reggae music songs. Go figure. Not a book. Dancing at a dance hall somewhere. Oh, who's this Garvey they keep talking about? Let me go read a book. Wow. Amazing. I was watching a little YouTube video, just give you a real example. Watching a YouTube video quite recently. A local artist, General Caution. Run around here for Larry Tacklin, Buck Burrows t-shirt on. I'm like, huh? Wow. Historical content. Now that gives me an opportunity to bridge that conversation whenever I see the little brother in the street. Hey, little bro, yeah, you got that t-shirt on. Okay, yeah, you might be rocking it because of this. Bro, long stuff, enough stuff to talk about. You see what I'm saying? I'm just throwing that part out. You see what I mean? But the ways in which music and these other ideas can convey. Right here in Bermuda, some of the calypso artists or the musicians used to play and make songs of protest or jibe at the white oligarchy, and perform for sometimes the tourists, but also for the locals. Gombe as a means of protest. Nowadays, we've touristified it, commodified it, so I appreciate my brother over there, because whenever you make it subject to capitalism, you water stuff down sometimes. Hip-hop, real hip-hop, vintage hip-hop, real reggae, slackness reggae. Those are really questions about commodification, but what's my broader point? Understanding that this is a multifaceted struggle. This is a multifaceted reality. The arts play a role, history plays a role, and it all dovetails together. So pick your point in the struggle, dig your heels in, and try and network with somebody and build, yeah?
And just to jump on the back of that, pick content that'll issue that'll impact you. It might be a book you read for that month. It might be a cache of songs you look at for the month. It might be some digitized media, YouTube, but all revolutionary study. That's not all they do, but the success of revolutionary study. So, and I'm not saying that's the only answer, but that's the practical thing you can do. Get a small collective and just study and make it part of like the culture, where it's not just a lecture you come to so many months, but on an ongoing basis you're studying outside of class or whatever. When I got to college, I couldn't wait for the summer because I felt like my classes got in the way of what I wanted to study. And for me, the summer was like when I really started to study what I needed to study. It wasn't in the classroom. It was outside of that. Like I felt like the classroom, I was just warming up my mind for the summertime. And even as a graduate student, I picked one day a week where I went to a separate archive and studied things that were not on the curriculum in classes. Like I made that a point. I built a practical, like a daily routine of study, and I had to finish a certain number of readings. And my colleagues at Howard could tell you I was a little over the top, And because we did stuff as a collective, I was now going out. I wasn't going to see Stone Love. Friday night till I finish this book. You're good, you won. I'm not gonna stir in love. I gotta finish this chapter first. But it's those kind of things that kind of, discipline as a collective that matters, because as an individual, you get tired. And it's hard to sustain. But a small group, pick an issue to study, and that's not all you should do, but that's the one consistent thing, that's the easiest thing you can do that's still transformative over the long run. You could have that starting, that could, right, indeed. Indeed, so, and you probably already have. So.
I was thinking for her.
Then I'm gonna come to you.
So knowing what we know about the effects of colonialism on racial justice, what is, in your opinion, sorry, should I start again? Knowing what we know about the effects of colonialism on racial justice, what is your opinion on how independence can create a more equitable society in Bermuda?
Oh, independence without the decolonization of the way we're thinking often leads to, I can frame it by way of a proverb. When the axe came to the forest, the tree said, look, the handle is one of us, right? So, and that's the importance of having decolonized education, first and foremost. If we don't understand how the heck we got to where we are, we tend to go off to LSE, London School of Economics, and Oxford University, getting the best that old white men have to offer. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that when we, armed with these degrees from these propaganda centers in Europe, we come back to lead our people, we lead them astray. It makes absolute sense. Right? It makes absolute sense. So I think that's why, for me, my wheelhouse is education. I want to have conversations with young folk, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, about these issues, so that they don't bump their heads up against the absurdity of white supremacy for the first time when they're like in university somewhere in Canada or the United States or the UK, and they're called nigger. And then all of a sudden they're like, but it's a bit late in the day. Not too late, but a bit late in the day. Or else, again, we run the risk of becoming like in Orwell's Animal Farm, the pigs who take leadership, having been schooled so well in the ways of the farmer. We don't want to be those folk.
Brother Rolf, we got until 4:20. Brother Rolf. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so my name's Daisha. I go to Work Academy, and I recently moved here about 2.5 years ago. And one of the first things that I noticed was the dynamic between elders and the youth. Firstly, the abundance of respect the youth does have for the elders. And I guess my question is directed to the elders in the room, but specifically the ones on the panel. What role can you play in helping the youth? I mean, in terms of like acceptance or just providing that listening ear. I mean, what changes can the elders make in their approach to helping the youth? Yeah.
Hold on a second. Panelists?
I think one of the efforts we can make is to listen better. I know generationally, sometimes, it's typical for older persons to seem to impart to younger people that they don't quite understand. Well, I do know I have 3 children, one who's a teenager. And believe me, she's taught me a whole lot. And one of the reasons is because I've taken the time she's had to actually show me what it means to listen. So I think to answer your question, I think part of our responsibility, the older generation that is to find the time to listen to the younger people in whatever setting and space that might be. And I'm saying it specifically because this is a formal structure, but I'm talking about an informal structure because I think that's really where the dialogue will take place, the genuineness and the sincerity. I want to move on to the next question about the independence issue. And just as the brother pointed out about decolonization, we have to decolonize our thinking primarily. That's the basis of it, because otherwise, if we don't, it means nothing if we make that big step. But what does that really mean? How do we decolonize our thinking? What effort will it require? Brother Keto pointed out about his commitment to study and making the sacrifice. If we're serious about it, it's the life commitment of Ms. Harvey, it's the life commitment of Dr. Hudson, and everyone else. It's not a fly-by thing. It's about ingraining in our minds what it is our ultimate destiny is while we're on this planet. And we have to anticipate that there will be more struggle and that it may be even more severe. So the price is, the question is, what's the price are we prepared to pay?
Yes, Sister Lynn.
I think you'd be surprised if you approach some of the elders in the community, and I would think even Dr. Hodgson, even though she's in her 95th year, would be open to talking to young people. And I think if you just open yourself up to approaching many of the elders, and I'm sure some of them down here don't think they're elders, but as far as they are, they think you're elders. Anyway, but approach them and say, will you come and talk to us or to a small group of us? And I think you'd be surprised that they will come because they value the voice of the young and want to listen to your point of view.
Yes.
I just have one thing, not a message back to that question, but for everyone in the room. And it's just one statement that age means nothing. And you can be as young as you want, you can be as old as you want, but that doesn't change how much you know and your experiences.
Thank you so much. Brother Rolf.
I think it's important for the generations to talk, because I remember as a teenager finding where Dr. Hodgson lived. Hello? Yeah? Finding where Dr. Hodgson lived and knocking on her door as like a 15 or 16-year-old and asking her, tell me what's going on in this island. I remember sitting off with Craig Simmons at his house, again, as a teenager, and asking pretty much the same question. I remember sitting with Hugh Ryle Richardson in his yard and asking as a teenager. I was going around and asking the questions. And Brother Lou, these are folk that I remember encountering Julian Hall in a classroom up here with Walton Brown, and I remember just sitting there saying, I want to be like that, you know? So it's important that our young people see examples of Black genius, right? And the willingness to engage in joyful resistance. Like for me, Dr. Hodgson and all those folk that I named still inspire me to this day, because I'm also very aware that the young folk, I'm not an elder, but there are young folk, just want to put that out on record right quick, but there are young folk who are looking at me. There are young folk who are looking at me too. You need to stop. You need to stop.
Brother Rolf.
Not an elder.
And if there are questions that you don't get to answer, you can approach the panelists after we close out, and you can ask them questions, as many as you like, for as long as you like.
Testing, 1, 2.
Okay. Until they take flight.
Testing.
Brother Rolf.
Okay, very quickly. This question can't be answered right now because we don't have enough time.
So then can you ask the question that will be answered?
I am. So we actually heard two competing narratives around Portuguese immigration on the panel. We had the narrative that was expounded by Ms. Winfield and Derek Burgess, and then we had a narrative by Mr. Rui Sa, and by a sidebar conversation I had with Dr. Jarvis. Competing narratives. Are those two narratives reconcilable? I don't know, but certainly we don't have enough time or the panel to address that. I just want to then move to Dr. Francis. Dr. Francis, I believe it was you who talked about this this concept of how racism was privatized. Was that you? Who? Dr. Maxwell, another son of members of the theater boycott as I am. Can you expand on that? And you talked about, for example, when it came to education and many other areas of Bermudian life, after emancipation, you see the gradual evolution or the privatization of racism in Bermuda.
Can you hear me? You're right. What happened after 1834 is that it was privatized. What happened was before then, everything was meant to be, the law was meant that it was meant to be public. That anything that was going to be public had to be integrated. The way around that was to privatize education. Now understand the consequences of that. It meant that people who were going to be educated would have to pay for it. It also meant that a large number of people would not be able to get access to it. But how did we respond to that? By creating a large number of schools, among which the Berkeley Institute is an example. And there were a number of them. Basically, by the time they were done, a governor was commenting that blacks provided a better education than the whites did. So yes, it was privatized, but we responded to it by making sure a large number of us got an education. And so the use of private space was the technique, was the way of, and then not just with education, but with a variety of other things, was the construction of a private space in order to be able to carry out policies that would otherwise be illegal.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you very much.
Is it a question?
It's a statement in response to the young.
You got to ask a question to a panelist, please.
Okay. Would you like to come to a forum entitled Tar Baby? Coming up shortly. Visit your email site called Tar Baby. I invite everybody in this room to come if you choose to. That is my question. Would you come and really hear what needs to be done? To the panel, in a forum like this, why haven't you come with the mechanics to mobilize these people to literally do something? Because what these folk have basically asked, and you haven't answered the question yet, the young people, and that lady in particular has got the scarf on her head, what they basically ask you is, what can I do? What should I do? And you've left them hanging. I stood here and watched the panel, and I also heard the moderator make his comment. The bottom line is, I spent as much time in jail as Nelson Mandela. My name is Dennis Bean. I'm a victim of racism, espionage, the whole 9 yards in Bermuda. We don't think that we have people that have suffered in Bermuda under this current regime, similar to what happened down in South Africa. I'm saying to you that as an elder, I'm 70 years old. As an elder, you would need to come and hear me and listen to what I have to say about the current situation in Bermuda. Bach Burris and Larry Tackler are two of my closest friends. Phil Parentchief, Jerome Parentchief, I go down the whole 9 yards. All the guys are tight. Bobby Bassett, the whole 9 yards. Guys who were expelled from the island. I will teach you and I will share with you, young lady, what you really need to know and what you can do to make a difference in this island, in this country.
Thank you.
These firms oftentimes waste people's time unless they can mobilize you to do something. The Black Beret cadre, by the way, came out of this similar mindset where we had meetings like this, and finally a group of brothers decided that they were going to do something. And so we became a black nationalist cultural movement to change things. I'm not alienating us from other complexions and whatnot, but you need to be instructed and taught. We're living in denial. It's not the name of a river in Egypt. We're living in denial. You need to come in here, Brother Dennis Bean, talk to you live and direct and answer your questions relative to the situations in Bermuda.
Thank you. But here we are. Here we are. And I think that there are several things that are important. Because number one, I think it's important that every voice be heard. But also, if anybody or groups of bodies had the solution, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here. So the fact that the issues that we are attempting to continue to focus on are so resilient and persistent necessitates that we still continue to raise the consciousness of people in order to potentially create persons who will help transform this intractable system of power that is so resilient and persistent. So no one person has the solution, because there is no single solution. It is multi-generational. It is embedded over centuries of dehumanization. And therefore, even if you were to argue that if it took us 500 years to get displaced, even if it takes us 500 years to break even, we need 500 years just to get to a place where we can begin to really engage in the kinds of, and then transformation is not a moment, it's a process. And I think that it is important for us to be able to have meaningful conversations without internalizing the same colonial division that has been imposed on us from the outside, that we then internalize and recreate on the inside in the name of having a solution. That's not a solution. So thank you so much for being here. Let me just, this sister had a question. Is that a question?
Like, we created this nonsense and we have to hold each other accountable.
Thank you. Is that a question? Quick question?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Carla John. I have a question for Rui Dasa. I'm hard of hearing, so I think you said Portuguese people were not a defiant people. Is that correct? Portuguese people were not a defiant people?
Well, in Bermuda.
Is that? They'll turn it up.
Yes. Well, I find in the way the Portuguese resisted, okay, they didn't resist with defiance, okay. They resisted sometimes with submission, okay, because there was a fear of reprisal, okay, and we see it even nowadays. Sometimes people are afraid to say things. People are afraid to talk about certain subjects because there's a fear that there can be some reprisal, and that's why I said that. Okay, but we can, if you look at the from a different perspective, if you look at the fact that some of the Portuguese members in the community fought for some freedoms, fought for some rights, you may look at that as being defiant and not submissive. Yeah, that's the way I see it. Yeah.
Thank you. As we now come to a close, let us give all of the panelists a big hand. And as we prepare to depart, let us ask and hold ourselves accountable and responsible as to how we can participate in transforming and moving towards more justice and equality.